Just the front page, Charlie, please. Yeah, I won't use the PowerPoint. That's it. Yeah. The time is limited, so I'm not going to use the PowerPoint. It slows me down a bit. But you have up there a quotation from Pat Rabbitte at the Burren Law School in 2010, not long before he entered government. It says, "Without statutory reform, the system of accountability we pretend to operate in this country is grounded in a lie." Now, that's pretty serious stuff, and that defines the gravity and the seriousness of the problem that was being tackled by the expert panel and the associated papers. Now, before I go into what is a critique of the work of the panel, I want to take a leaf out of the Garda Commissioner's book in framing what I have to say, because I have some hard things to say about it. The Garda Commissioner enumerated the many outstanding achievements of the Gardaí in keeping the peace, fighting crime, dealing with subversion, making the roads safer, and so on. But she then went on to say that something went terribly wrong in the Garda Síochána, and it wasn't a blip. It was the long-standing, deep-seated flaws in the culture of the Garda Síochána, which seemed to spawn from one decade to the next a whole series of really serious problems. Commissioner O'Sullivan made it clear that this time they were going to get it right. That if there was a GSOC Mark 1 that was inadequate, well then GSOC Mark 2 was going to work, and all that went with GSOC and reform of the Gardaí. Now, I view the civil service in precisely the same light. I have the highest regard and esteem. I hold them in the very highest esteem, the civil service, just as I do the Guards. They've made tremendous achievements, just taking the last decade in helping the country get out of the predicament it was in. And with the specific topic of reform, you have here Robert Watt from the Secretary-General of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, who have driven a massive agenda of reform, which was enumerated here by Teresa Reedy from UCC the other night. And in addition to what Teresa Reedy talked about, there are 14 major programmes that have been unfolding in the last 3 years within Robert's department, and they're in there on the wall, and you can track how they're doing in the execution of those. So implementation deficit disorder does not exist within the Department of Public Expenditure Reform. But as with the Gardaí, for all their achievements, something went terribly wrong in the civil service that contributed in a significant way to the catastrophic failures that occurred in this country. So while recognising their achievements, I want to focus on what I believe to be one of the 2 or 3 root causes of the calamitous failure of the civil service. And calamity is not an understatement if you look at what the fallout of it was. And that issue that I want to focus on is accountability, the system of accountability, because that is at the very core of what needs to be addressed. Now, I was involved in a group like the expert panel in 2002. It was chaired by Paddy Malarkey, who was Secretary-General, had been Secretary-General of Finance, in which we sought to set out the respective responsibilities of ministers and civil servants. But when it came to the conclusion, in trying to separate out the respective responsibilities of ministers and Secretary-Generals, we fudged the issue. And in an unspoken conclusion, in conversations that was never written down, the undocumented conclusion was you really couldn't hold Secretary-Generals accountable because if their performance was poor, it would reflect badly on the minister. So here you have what others have called the Faustian Pact, a closed loop between the minister and the most senior official. Now, Pat Rabbitte, in this paper, very scholarly, forensic analysis of the system of accountability in the Burren School, said the current system is grounded in a lie. He said it enables civil servants to hide behind the skirts of ministers and for ministers to avoid responsibility. The old story of how did this happen? I took the advice of my officials, but the officials were barred by law from saying what that advice was. Now, I'm aware of all the complexities of that, but that's the bottom line. So you can never get at what's happening between these two parties, the Minister and the Secretary-General or the senior officials. Pat Rabbitte said, if questions are asked as to who actually decided what, when and why, if questions are asked, the corporate veil descends upon the entire department. What is needed, said Rabbitte, was to redefine the relationship between ministers and their departments. If the minister takes a decision personally, he or she should say so and account for it. If a decision is taken by the departments under a delegated power, then the relevant named official should say so and take account for it. When ministers are to blame, the sister should identify that, rather than shielding them, and the same goes for officials. So this was a big issue coming up to the formation of the programme of government, which Kevin has referred to. In the programme for government, there was a promise of fundamental reform of this charade. And I quote from it, it said, there is a huge accountability gap, as reflected in this quote. And you may remember some of these statements. We will pin down accountability for results at every level, from ministers down. You remember the scorecard, with clear consequences for success or failure. That's important. Ministers should be responsible for policy and public service managers for delivery. We will legislate for a reformulated code of laws, replacing both the Ministers and Secretaries Act of 1924 and the Public Service Management Act of 1997. Restrictions on the nature and extent of evidence by civil service to Oireachtas committees will be scrapped and replaced by new guidelines for civil servants that reflect the reality of the authority delegated to them and their personal accountability for the way it's exercised. So it would be prizing open this relationship between the two. So it was in the programme for government, and as on many other issues, the government has begun to deliver. So the first paper that was produced, as Kevin said, was this one in January of this year. It's called Strengthening Civil Service Accountability and Performance. It's a terrific paper. It was created by a set of officials who worked for the best part of 2 years to put that together. It was an excellent, courageous paper. And what they did was they raised all the hard questions. There were no taboos. They named every elephant in the room. And for me, the core question they asked, I quote, and here was the question they posed: how far should public servants rely on their professionalism and sense of personal morality? And how far should they simply follow instructions from their political masters? Crucial question. And I have seen that debated between senior civil servants. And there are those who will hold the view the way democracy works is the minister's elected, he's appointed, and you carry out the instructions. There are other civil servants who will say, well, hang on a second. What if the minister tells you there's something you know is truly wrong? What do you do? And I've heard two answers to that. One is you do it, and the second answer is one is you don't. You follow your professionalism and sense of personality. So that is a key issue right at the heart of this thing. The same paper describes accountability as an icon, a defining feature of good governance. Public accountability provides a democratic mechanism to prevent corruption and the abuse of power. Following an avoidable disaster or tragedy, of which we have had many, accountability can also provide the opportunity for public catharsis. The public needs a catharsis in relation to the banking collapse, for example. Accountability discharges a pivotal role in bolstering the legitimacy of government authority and public confidence in the effectiveness of public administration. The meaning of accountability. Terrific definition of accountability in this first paper. The original and long-standing core meaning of accountability and its conventional usage within the government system, such as ours and the Westminster system, is as follows: the formal obligation to submit to a mechanism designed to achieve external scrutiny in explaining and justifying past conduct or actions, and I underline this, and with the possibility of facing consequences arising. They add that accountability is personal and virtuous. It's equated with a set of standards for the evaluation of behaviour of public agents. Being accountable is a positive quality or virtue. And I would add, it's a mark of adult maturity that there be accountability, personal accountability. So I want to comment on 5 elements of the expert panel's recommendations. And one is, do the recommendations unpick these intertwined relationships between the Minister and the Secretary-General? Secondly, do they deal with the restrictions on evidence to Oireachtas committees? Do they deal with subjection to external scrutiny with consequences for success or failure? And where do they attach primacy to either professionalism and individual moral conscience or following political orders? Separating intertwined ministers' and Secretary-General's responsibilities. The panel, I'm quoting, the panel is confident that the legislative framework does not provide obstacles to strengthening accountability. The Public Service Management Act of 1997 provides statutory framework for assignment of specific functions from Secretary-Generals to officials within their department. They're silent on the 1924 Act, which conflates the Ministers' and Secretary-General's responsibilities. Let me explain what that means. What the panel has said is that if this is the Minister and this is the Secretary-General, all that the existing legislation provides for is delegation below that, below the Secretary-General. But what it does not deal with is decoupling these two crucial elements in the architecture of the system. The panel does not deal with that, because that's the 1924 Act, which conflates the two roles. So the scope for hiding behind each other's skirts remains. Restrictions on giving evidence to Oireachtas committees. These are supposed to be scrapped. The independent expert panel is silent on this vital issue, other than to say the new Houses of the Oireachtas Act 2013 deal with it. I've looked at the new Houses of the Oireachtas Act 2013, and it doesn't deal with it. It's full of loopholes that ministers and officials can use in order to remain mum before Oireachtas committees. On external scrutiny, which Kevin spent some time on, the accountability of this overarching board, which is supposed to deliver external scrutiny, has the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach, the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, 4 Secretary-Generals. That's 7 people from within inside the system and 4 external members. If you ask me, does the balance of that give me confidence that you'll get real, authentic external scrutiny? My answer would be no. Accountability and the promise of consequences. We will pin down accountability with clear consequences. Has it dealt with that? It hasn't dealt with that, because its recommendations are that they say that we're recommending stronger, more robust supports for managers in dealing with non-performance and underperformance. These would assist underperformance through identification and development measures in raising the performance. The answer to poor performance, as it was in the discredited performance management and development system, is a development programme for the person who's not performing. So non-performers can settle into a life of mediocre or non-performance until they're pensioned. And they eschew, they don't make provision for people being fired. So the final one, second last one, is the professionalism and personal morality versus following instructions from your political masters. Now, this to me is the touchstone of this, and the independent panel is silent on that issue. That is the big issue that needs to be discussed at length within the system. What's interesting is that there was a submission made to the panel, which was quoted in the Cork Examiner. I tried to get my hands on it and I couldn't, from heads of internal audit within the civil service. These are senior civil service themselves. And I quote, this is from their submission to the panel on this issue of the conflation of the two roles. Some of the inaction by senior civil servants was as a result of their roles being too politicised, relationships too close, and a lack of culture of constructive challenge even behind closed doors. There's a primary failure was an inability or unwillingness to defend against poor policy direction and exaggerated political manifestos from government and the commercial world. Irish politics is partisan, locally based and short-term. A culture of deference, for example. Finally, since I've very little time left, I want to make one or two final remarks. My overall assessment of the initiative on strengthening civil service accountability, I'm summarising now, Don. First of all, there are several welcome and necessary recommendations. I agree with many of them, the overarching board, more delegated authority and so on. But the edge and sharpness of the first paper, this one, was lost in the expert panel's consultations and recommendations. Ministers and Secretary-Generals can still hide behind each other's skirts. Civil servants are, when you read the legislation 2013 closely, are still restricted on giving evidence to Oireachtas committees. There are too many loopholes in that legislation. There is weak external scrutiny. It doesn't look to me like real external scrutiny. There are no effective sanctions and consequences. And the question of personal morality and professionalism versus following the instructions of political masters, it's silent. In conclusion, we paid a terrible price for failures in governance and accountability. This, what we're talking about right here, is arguably the single most important needed reform because it's pivotal, on which almost everything else turns. The independent panel recommendations fail on vital elements. As one of our colleagues said, I don't know if it was Donald the Butler, said, the mice got at it during the consultations. Now, you know, it sounds then that I'm finishing on a very pessimistic note, but I'll finish on a hopeful note. One of the most interesting things to me in the last couple of months is that the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform has come forward with proposals, new legislation on freedom of information and whistleblowers in particular. So they put them out there. They've got pushback, challenge from people who said, hang on, you haven't gone far enough. There are loopholes in this. It's a new bucket with a hole in it. And those challenges have been accepted by the department and have led to a restatement of the legislation such that the legislation that is now in train in relation to freedom of information and whistleblowers will be the real deal. And I would hope that this work is unfinished, and I would hope that some of the challenges that I've set out in good faith would be taken on board, and given what's recently happened in relation to those and if you like, the attitude of the department to challenge augurs well for the future. Thank you very much.